Settle in, close your eyes, and let me take you on a gentle journey through the most peculiar dining experiences of our ancestors. Tonight we'll explore the strange, the wonderful, and the downright bizarre meals that once graced tables across the world. The Roman feast that changed everything. Let's begin our journey in ancient Rome, around 50 A.D., where the wealthy senator Marcus Aurelius Gastronicus is hosting what would become one of the most talked-about dinner parties in Roman history. But this isn't your typical feast of roasted peacock and honey-glazed dormice. Picture this: guests reclining on silk-covered couches, oil lamps flickering against marble walls, and servants bringing out the first course. But instead of the expected delicacies, they're served jellyfish. Yes, jellyfish, carefully prepared, seasoned with garum, fermented fish sauce, and served as a delicacy that supposedly increased one's intelligence. The Romans, you see, had a fascinating relationship with food that would seem utterly alien to us today. They believed that eating the brain of a peacock would grant wisdom, that consuming the heart of a lion would make one brave, and the jellyfish, those translucent, ethereal creatures of the sea, could sharpen the mind. Our senator's guests that evening also enjoyed a dish called libum, a cheesecake made with honey and bay leaves, offered to the gods before being consumed. But the real conversation starter was the mulsum, a honeyed wine mixed with ground pearls. Yes, actual pearls dissolved in wine, believed to preserve youth and beauty. As the evening progressed, the servants brought out stranger and stranger dishes. There was ova spherica, perfectly round eggs from exotic birds, served in nests made of spun sugar. There was panis quadratus, bread baked in precise squares, each marked with the baker's seal. And then the pièce de résistance, phoenix eggs. Now, these weren't actually from phoenixes, of course. They were elaborate confections made to look like mythical phoenix eggs. Hollow sugar shells filled with spiced wine, designed to crack when bitten, releasing their liquid contents in a burst of flavor. The Romans loved their culinary theater almost as much as they loved their gladiatorial games. But perhaps the strangest dish of all was the gustatio, the appetizer course that included ova ex echinis, sea urchin eggs, mixed with honey and pepper. The Romans believed these spiny creatures of the sea held the secrets of eternal life, and consuming their eggs was thought to transfer some of that immortality to the diner. As our Roman guests settled into their evening, discussing philosophy and politics between bites of jellied eel and honey-soaked dates, they had no idea that their seemingly exotic feast was actually quite typical for their time. What seems bizarre to us was simply dinner, the medieval banquet of impossible things. Let's drift forward in time now, to medieval England, around 1380, where Lady Eleanor of Gloucester is preparing for a feast that would make even the Romans raise an eyebrows. The occasion? The Feast of Fools, a topsy-turvy celebration where everything was deliberately backwards, including the food. The great hall of her castle was decorated with tapestries hung upside down, candles placed on the floor instead of tables, and the high table set with the strangest array of dishes ever conceived. The centerpiece was a massive subtlety, a decorative dish that was more art than food, shaped like a dragon, but when carved open, revealed not meat, but peacock feathers arranged around a core of sweetened almond paste. But the real strangeness began with the impossible dishes. First came the mortreuse, a dish that appeared to be a simple stew, but contained ingredients that shouldn't exist together. Meat and dairy, forbidden by church law, sweet and savory, unheard of in medieval cooking, and hot and cold served in the same bowl, with one half steaming and the other chilled with snow. The medieval mind, you see, was fascinated by paradoxes and impossibilities. Their food reflected this obsession with the impossible made manifest. They served coffins, not the burial kind, but elaborate pie crusts shaped like actual coffins, filled with whole birds that had been carefully deboned and reformed to look like they were alive, their heads poking out of the pastry as if they were merely sleeping. Lady Eleanor's kitchen had spent days preparing blancmange, a dish that appeared to be simple white custard, but was actually an intricate creation made from ground almonds, rice, and shredded chicken, all pounded together until it was impossible to distinguish one ingredient from another. The result was a dish that was simultaneously meat and vegetable, solid and liquid, familiar and utterly alien. But perhaps the strangest course was the entremet, literally meaning between meals, which consisted of live birds released from pies, but not in the nursery rhyme sense. These birds had been carefully trained to carry scrolls of poetry in their beaks, and when released, they would fly around the great hall, dropping verses of love songs and political satire onto the heads of surprised guests. The feast continued with frumenty, a porridge made from wheat berries that had been cracked by hand, then boiled with milk from 7 different animals: cow, goat, sheep, horse, deer, and 2 others that the chroniclers refused to name, claiming they were too strange for Christian ears. As the evening wore on, the guests were served pottage, a soup that defied all logic. It was made from ingredients that represented all 4 elements: earth, root vegetables; water, broth; air, whipped egg whites; and fire, ground pepper so hot it made grown knights weep. Eating it was said to bring balance to one's humors and grant prophetic dreams. The meal concluded with wafers, thin, crispy breads that had been printed with religious scenes using carved wooden blocks, so that consuming them was literally eating the images of saints and angels. Each wafer told a story, and skilled diners could read their dessert before consuming it. The Viking feast of eternal winter. Our journey through time now takes us north to the frozen fjords of Norway around 950 AD, where the Viking chieftain Bjorn Ironside is preparing for a feast that will last 3 days and 3 nights, celebrating the winter solstice with foods that would help his people survive the endless darkness ahead. The Vikings, contrary to popular belief, were not just raiders and warriors. They were also remarkable cooks who had developed unique preservation techniques and food combinations out of necessity. Their climate was harsh, their growing season short, and their survival often depended on making the most of every available resource. The feast began with bloddenmør, blood sausage that had been buried in the ground for 6 months, allowing it to ferment and develop a complex cheese-like flavor. This wasn't just food, it was a kind of time capsule, preserving the summer's abundance for the winter scarcity. Next came gravlax, but not the delicate dill-cured salmon we know today. The Viking version was buried in a mixture of salt, pine needles, and fermented shark oil, then left underground for an entire season. When unearthed, it had transformed into something that was part fish, part earth, part tree, a truly elemental food that tasted like the very essence of the Scandinavian wilderness. The Vikings also served hakarl, fermented shark meat that had been buried in gravel for 4 months, then hung to dry for another 4. The fermentation process was necessary because fresh shark meat was poisonous, but the long curing process transformed it into something edible, if not exactly pleasant. It was said that anyone who could eat hakarl without flinching was ready to face any challenge the sea might throw at them. But perhaps the most unusual dish was skyr, a fermented dairy product that wasn't quite cheese, wasn't quite yogurt, and wasn't quite anything else. It was made by adding rennet to milk, then hanging it in sealskin bags for months, allowing the whey to drain out while the curds developed a tangy, almost wine-like flavor. The result was a food that could last for years without spoiling and provided complete nutrition during the darkest months. The Vikings also had a drink called mjød, or mead, but theirs was unlike any honey wine made before or since. It was fermented with wild berries, pine bark, and sometimes even ground antlers from reindeer. The fermentation process took place in underground chambers where the constant earth temperature and complete darkness created the perfect environment for transformation. During the feast, the Vikings would tell stories of their travels, and with each tale they would produce a small wrapped package of food they had carried back from distant lands. There might be godel from Roman territories, preserved dates from the Mediterranean, or strange spices from the Byzantine Empire. These exotic ingredients were incorporated into traditional Viking dishes, creating fusion foods that bridged vast cultural distances. One of the most prized dishes was reindeer hearts, not just roasted, but stuffed with a mixture of cloudberries, wild herbs, and fermented fish oil, then wrapped in the animal's own hide and buried in coals for an entire day. The slow cooking process transformed the tough muscle into something tender and complex, while the wrapping retained all the juices and flavors. The feast would continue through the night, with each course representing a different aspect of survival. There was pemmican, a concentrated mixture of dried meat, fat, and berries that could sustain a warrior for days. There was lutefish, fish that had been treated with lye to preserve it, creating a gelatinous, almost soap-like texture that was surprisingly nutritious. As dawn broke on the 3rd day, the feast concluded with brennivin, a powerful alcohol distilled from fermented potatoes and flavored with caraway seeds. It was said that drinking it would grant visions of the future, and many Vikings claim to have seen their fate in the bottom of their cups.
The Chinese Imperial Kitchen of Wonders. Let's drift eastward now to the Forbidden City in Beijing, around 1420, during the reign of Emperor Yongle. Here, in the most elaborate kitchen complex ever constructed, the imperial cooks are preparing a meal that would redefine the very concept of culinary artistry. The Chinese approach to food was fundamentally different from anything we've encountered so far. Where the Romans sought spectacle and the Vikings prioritized preservation, the Chinese pursued harmony, not just of flavors, but of colors, textures, temperatures, and even philosophical concepts. The meal began with yan wo, bird's nest soup, but not just any bird's nest. These were the nests of swiftlets, small birds that built their homes entirely from their own saliva, high in the caves of Southeast Asia. The nests were harvested at great risk and expense, then carefully cleaned strand by strand, removing every trace of feather and debris until only the pure, translucent saliva remained. When cooked, these nests dissolved into a gelatinous, almost ethereal broth that was said to grant immortality. The emperor's version was flavored with ginseng, deer antler, and cordyceps, a fungus that grew only on the bodies of caterpillars high in the Tibetan mountains. Each bowl represented months of preparation and ingredients that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. The next course was pidan, or century eggs, though they weren't actually aged for a century. These duck eggs had been preserved in a mixture of clay, ash, salt, quicklime, and rice hulls for several weeks, transforming them into something that looked and tasted like nothing else on earth. The whites became a brown, jelly-like substance, while the yolks turned dark green and cheese-like, with a complex, almost mineral flavor. But perhaps the most extraordinary dish was fu tiao chang, or Buddha jumps over the wall, a soup so delicious that it was said even Buddhist monks would abandon their vows to taste it. The preparation began weeks in advance, with each ingredient requiring its own specific treatment. Shark fins were soaked and cleaned. Sea cucumbers were rehydrated and massaged. Abalone was tenderized through a process that took days. The cooking process itself was a ritual. Each ingredient was added to the pot at precisely the right moment, and the soup was simmered for hours over a fire that was never allowed to flame, only glow. The result was a broth of such complexity that it was said to contain the essence of the entire ocean. The imperial kitchen also prepared yaunrohuan. The imperial kitchen also prepared yaunraochuan, or skewers of lamb, that had been marinated in a mixture of fermented bean paste, rice wine, and ground pearls, then grilled over charcoal made from specific types of wood that grew only in the mountains of Sichuan. The meat was so tender it could be cut with a chopstick, and the flavor was unlike anything that existed outside the imperial palace. Between courses, the emperor and his guests would cleanse their palates with xuer, or snow fungus, a white gelatinous mushroom that grew on dead trees. It was served in a light syrup flavored with osmanthus flowers and rock sugar, creating a dessert that was simultaneously refreshing and substantial. The meal continued with dongpo ro, pork belly that had been braised in a mixture of soy sauce, rice wine, and brown sugar for so long that it had achieved a perfect balance between fat and lean, liquid and solid. The meat was so soft it could be eaten with a spoon, yet it retained its shape and texture perfectly. As the evening progressed, the courses became increasingly elaborate. There was beggar's chicken, a whole chicken stuffed with sticky rice, mushrooms, and Chinese sausage, then wrapped in lotus leaves and clay, before being buried in coals for hours. When the clay was cracked open at the table, the chicken emerged perfectly cooked, infused with the flavors of the lotus leaves and the earth itself. The meal concluded with tang yuan, sweet dumplings filled with black sesame paste and floating in a light broth flavored with fermented rice wine. These dumplings were shaped to represent the full moon, and eating them was said to bring good fortune and family unity. The Aztec Feast of the Gods. Our journey now takes us across the Pacific to the great city of Tenochtitlan, around 1500, just before the arrival of the Spanish conquistadors. Here, in the heart of the Aztec Empire, Emperor Moctezuma II is preparing for a feast that would honor the gods and celebrate the abundance of the New World. The Aztecs had developed a cuisine that was completely unlike anything found in Europe or Asia. Their ingredients were native to the Americas. Their cooking techniques were uniquely their own, and their understanding of nutrition was remarkably advanced for their time. The feast began with atole, a warm drink made from ground corn. But this wasn't simple cornmeal. The corn had been treated with lime water in a process called nixtamalization, which not only made it easier to grind, but also increased its nutritional value by making niacin available to the body. The atole was flavored with vanilla, chocolate, and honey, creating a drink that was both nourishing and delicious. Next came tlacoyos, thick tortillas stuffed with beans and topped with nopal cactus, quelites, wild greens, and chapulines, grasshoppers. The grasshoppers were roasted with garlic and lime, creating a crunchy, protein-rich topping that was both practical and delicious. The Aztecs had no large domesticated animals, so insects were an important source of protein in their diet. The centerpiece of the feast was mole, but not the mole we know today. This was the original version, made with over 30 different ingredients, including various chiles, chocolate, tomatoes, and spices. The preparation took days, with each ingredient being toasted, ground, and combined in a specific order. The result was a sauce of incredible complexity that was said to contain the essence of the earth itself. The mole was served over guajolote, turkey that had been slow roasted in underground ovens. The meat was so tender it fell off the bone, and the combination of the complex sauce with the mild turkey created a dish that was both earthly and divine. But perhaps the most unusual dish was escamoles, the larvae of ants that lived in the roots of agave plants. These were considered such a delicacy that they were called insect caviar. They were lightly sautéed with epazote and served in small tortillas, creating a dish that was both exotic and surprisingly familiar. The Aztecs also served amaranth, a grain that was formed into shapes of their gods and then eaten as part of religious ceremonies. The amaranth was mixed with honey and formed into elaborate sculptures that were both art and food, representing the connection between the physical and spiritual worlds. Another unusual delicacy was huitlacoche, the fungus that grows on corn kernels. Rather than seeing this as a disease to be prevented, the Aztecs cultivated it as a delicacy. The fungus-infected kernels were harvested and cooked with onions and chiles, creating a dish with a complex, earthy flavor that was unlike anything else. The feast continued with chia fresca, a drink made from chia seeds soaked in water and flavored with lime and honey.
the seeds absorbed the liquid and became gelatinous, creating a drink that was both refreshing and filling. Chia seeds were so valued by the Aztecs that they were sometimes used as currency. As the evening progressed, the guests were served tepache, a fermented beverage made from pineapple rinds, cinnamon, and brown sugar. The fermentation process created a mildly alcoholic drink that was both sweet and slightly tangy, perfect for washing down the rich, complex flavors of the meal. The meal concluded with chocolato, drinking chocolate, but not the sweet drink we know today. This was bitter, frothy, and spiced with chiles and vanilla. It was prepared by pouring it from one vessel to another from a great height, creating a foam that was considered essential to the drink's spiritual properties.
The medieval Islamic feast of the senses. Let's continue our journey eastward to Baghdad, around 850 AD, during the golden age of the Abbasid Caliphate. Here in the House of Wisdom, the scholar and poet Ibrahim al-Mahdi is hosting a feast that would combine the culinary traditions of Persia, Arabia, and the Byzantine Empire into something entirely new. The Islamic world of the 9th century was a crossroads of cultures, and nowhere was this more evident than in the kitchen. Spices from India, silk from China, and cooking techniques from across the known world all converged in the bustling markets and grand palaces of Baghdad. The feast began with ma'mul, delicate pastries filled with dates, pistachios, and rosewater, each one shaped like a small work of art. These weren't just cookies, they were edible poetry, with each flavor representing a different aspect of paradise as described in Islamic texts. Next came kibbeh, but not the simple fried version we know today. This was kibbeh naye, raw lamb mixed with bulgur wheat and spices, formed into perfect spheres and served with wild herbs and flatbread. The lamb was so fresh it had been slaughtered that morning, and the spices were ground moments before serving. The centerpiece of the meal was sikbaj, a sweet and sour stew that represented the perfect balance of flavors. It contained lamb, apricots, almonds, and spices, all slow-cooked in a sauce made from grape molasses and vinegar. The dish was served in a bowl made from hollowed-out bread, which absorbed the flavors of the stew and became part of the meal itself. But perhaps the most unusual dish was muri, a fermented sauce made from barley that had been aged for months in the desert sun. The fermentation process created a complex, almost wine-like flavor that was used to enhance other dishes. It was said that a skilled cook could create 100 different flavors of muri, each one representing a different aspect of the divine. The Islamic feast also featured labane, a thick yogurt that had been strained through cloth for days, concentrating the flavor and creating a texture that was almost cheese-like. It was served with honey, nuts, and rose petals, creating a dessert that was both refreshing and indulgent. Another remarkable dish was mashi, vegetables stuffed with rice, herbs, and spices, then slow-cooked in a broth flavored with cinnamon and allspice. The vegetables, eggplant, zucchini, grape leaves, were chosen not just for their flavor, but for their symbolic meaning.
representing the abundance of the earth and the generosity of the divine. The meal continued with mutabal, a dish made from roasted eggplant that had been charred over an open fire until the skin was black and the flesh was smoky and tender. The eggplant was then mixed with tahini, lemon juice, and garlic, creating a dip that was both earthy and refined. As the evening progressed, the guests were served katayef, delicate pancakes filled with cheese or nuts and drizzled with honey. These were served warm, with the filling still slightly liquid, creating a contrast of temperatures and textures that was both comforting and elegant. The feast concluded with attar, rose water mixed with sugar and served in small glasses. This wasn't just a drink, it was a sensory experience, with the floral aroma filling the room and the sweet liquid coating the palate, leaving a lingering taste of paradise.
The Japanese tea ceremony that became a meal. Now let's journey to Japan, around 1580, during the time of the great tea master Sen Norikyu. Here, in a small tea house in Kyoto, a group of samurai and scholars are gathering for what would become one of the most influential meals in Japanese history, the first formal kaiseki dinner. The Japanese approach to food was fundamentally different from everything we've encountered so far. Where other cultures sought abundance or spectacle, the Japanese pursued restraint, seasonality, and the perfect expression of each ingredient's natural character. The meal began with sakizuke, a single perfect bite that represented the season. In this case, it was a cherry blossom petal that had been pickled in salts and vinegar, then wrapped around a small piece of white fish. The combination of the floral blossom and the delicate fish created a taste that was both familiar and utterly unique. Next came suimono, a clear broth so transparent it seemed like drinking liquid air. The broth was made from konbu seaweed and katsuobushi, dried bonito flakes, but the preparation was a ritual in itself. The konbu was heated slowly, never allowed to boil, and removed at the exact moment when it had given up its essence, but not its bitterness. The katsuobushi was shaved paper-thin and added to the hot water for exactly 30 seconds before being strained out. The result was a broth that tasted like the essence of the sea itself, served in bowls that had been warmed to exactly body temperature. Floating in the broth was a single perfect cube of tofu and a carefully carved piece of bamboo shoot, representing the harmony between land and sea.
The meal continued with sashimi, but not the simple sliced fish we know today. This was ikizukuri, fish that had been kept alive until the moment of serving, then prepared with such skill that it was still moving when presented to the guests. The fish was arranged on a bed of ice carved into the shape of ocean waves, creating the illusion that it was still swimming. But perhaps the most unusual dish was shiraku, the reproductive organs of monkfish, prepared in a way that transformed them into something that resembled clouds. The organs were steamed with sake and mirin, then whipped into a foam that was so light it seemed to dissolve on the tongue. It was served in small lacquered bowls, each one decorated with a different seasonal motif. The kaiseki meal also featured takoyaki, but not the popular street food we know today. This was the original version, whole baby octopus that had been massaged for hours until they were tender, then grilled over charcoal and served with a sauce made from their own ink. The octopus was so tender it could be eaten with chopsticks, and the ink sauce added a deep oceanic flavor that was both primal and refined. Another remarkable dish was fugu, the potentially deadly pufferfish that required a licensed chef to prepare. The fish was sliced so thin it was almost transparent, then arranged on a plate painted with cherry blossoms. The slight numbing sensation on the tongue was part of the experience, a reminder of the thin line between life and death that was central to Japanese philosophy. The meal continued with chawanmushi, a savory egg custard that contained tiny treasures, a single shrimp, a piece of mushroom, a ginkgo nut. Each spoonful was a surprise, and the custard was so delicate it had to be eaten with a special spoon made from bamboo. As the evening progressed, the dishes became increasingly minimalist. There was yakimono, a single piece of sea bream that had been grilled over charcoal and served with nothing but a small mound of grated daikon radish. The fish was so fresh and perfectly cooked that it needed no enhancement, and the radish provided just enough contrast to highlight the natural flavors. The meal concluded with mizumono, a simple dessert of seasonal fruit. In this case, it was a single perfect persimmon that had been aged until it was perfectly soft and sweet. The fruit was served on a small plate made from a fallen leaf, emphasizing the connection between the food and the natural world.
The Inca Feast of the Sun. Our journey now takes us high into the Andes Mountains, to the great city of Cusco, around 1450, during the reign of the Inca Emperor Pachacuti. Here, at an altitude of over 11,000 feet, the Inca are preparing for Inti Raymi, the Festival of the Sun, with foods that have been specifically adapted to thrive in one of the world's most challenging environments. The Inca had developed a cuisine that was perfectly suited to their mountainous environment. Their ingredients were native to the high Andes. Their preservation techniques were designed to cope with extreme temperature variations, and their understanding of nutrition was remarkably sophisticated. The feast began with chicha, a fermented beverage made from corn, but the preparation was unlike anything we've encountered. The corn was chewed by young women whose saliva helped to start the fermentation process. The chewed corn was then mixed with water and allowed to ferment for days, creating an alcoholic drink that was both nourishing and mildly intoxicating. Next came cuy, roasted guinea pig, which was considered the most prized meat in the Inca Empire. The guinea pigs were raised in the homes of the nobility, fed on a diet of herbs and vegetables, and were said to be so tender they could be eaten with a spoon. The meat was roasted whole over open fires, then served with ají, a spicy sauce made from hot peppers and herbs. But perhaps the most unusual dish was charqui, the origin of our word jerky, but this was far more sophisticated than the simple dried meat we know today. The meat was cut into thin strips and dried at high altitude, where the combination of intense UV radiation and low humidity created the perfect conditions for preservation. The result was a meat that could last for years without spoiling and retained most of its nutritional value. The Inca also served quinoa, but not the simple grain we know today. This was quinoa real, a special variety that was reserved for the emperor and the nobility. The grain was toasted until it was golden and nutty, then cooked with llama milk and flavored with herbs that grew only at high altitude. Another remarkable dish was chuño, freeze-dried potatoes that had been created through a process that took advantage of the extreme temperature variations in the Andes. The potatoes were left outside overnight to freeze, then trampled to remove the moisture, then dried in the sun. The process was repeated for several days until the potatoes were completely dehydrated and could be stored for decades. The feast continued with quinoa, a soup made from quinoa, llama meat, and vegetables, all cooked together in a broth that was seasoned with muña, a wild mint that grew only in the high Andes. The soup was served in bowls made from gourds that had been grown specifically for this purpose. As the evening progressed, the guests were served api, a thick, porridge-like drink made from purple corn. The corn was ground by hand on stone mortars, then cooked with water and spices until it reached the perfect consistency. The drink was both nutritious and filling, perfect for the high-altitude environment where calories were precious. The meal concluded with tanta, a special bread made from potatoes and quinoa flour. The bread was baked in underground ovens that had been heated with hot stones, creating a crust that was crispy on the outside and soft on the inside. The bread was served with fresh cheese made from llama milk and honey collected from wild bees.
The Australian Aboriginal Feast of the Dreamtime.
Let's continue our journey to the vast continent of Australia, around 1400, where the Aboriginal peoples have been living for over 40,000 years, developing one of the world's most sophisticated and sustainable food systems. The Aboriginal approach to food was fundamentally different from anything we've encountered. Rather than domesticating plants and animals, they had developed an intimate knowledge of the natural world that allowed them to find food in even the most barren environments. The feast began with witchetty grubs, large white larvae that lived in the roots of ghost gum trees. These grubs were considered such a delicacy that they were reserved for special occasions. They were roasted over hot coals until the skin was crispy and the inside was creamy, creating a taste that was nutty and rich. Next came bush tomatoes, small fruits that grew wild in the desert and had been dried and ground into a powder. The powder was mixed with water to create a paste that was both tangy and slightly sweet, perfect for seasoning other foods. But perhaps the most unusual dish was bunya nuts, large seeds from the bunya pine that fruited only every 3 years. When the trees were in fruit, Aboriginal tribes would travel hundreds of miles to harvest the nuts, creating gatherings that were both social and spiritual. The nuts were roasted in the coals of special fires, then cracked open to reveal a kernel that was both nutritious and delicious. The Aboriginal feast also featured kangaroo, but not simply roasted. The meat was wrapped in the animal's own skin, along with native herbs and vegetables, then buried in a pit with hot coals. The slow cooking process, which took an entire day, created meat that was tender and flavorful, infused with the essence of the earth itself. Another remarkable dish was damper, a simple bread made from native grass seeds that had been ground into flour. The flour was mixed with water and cooked on hot stones, creating a bread that was both nutritious and portable. The bread was often flavored with native herbs and sometimes contained dried fruits or nuts. The meal continued with yabbies, freshwater crayfish that were caught in the rivers and streams of the continent. The yabbies were cooked in special earth ovens where they were surrounded by hot stones and leaves, creating a steam that cooked them perfectly. The result was meat that was sweet and tender, with a flavor that was uniquely Australian. As the evening progressed, the guests were served quandongs, native peaches that were both sweet and tart. The fruit was often dried and ground into a powder that could be stored for months, providing vitamin C during the dry season. The feast concluded with billy tea, a simple tea made from native plants that were steeped in hot water. The tea was served in containers made from bark or gourds, and the act of sharing the tea was as important as the drink itself. The Polynesian Feast of the Pacific. Our journey now takes us to the islands of Polynesia around 1200, where the great navigators had been sailing across the Pacific for centuries, developing a cuisine that celebrates the bounty of the ocean and the volcanic soil of their island homes. The Polynesian approach to food was shaped by their island environment. With limited land for agriculture, they had to make the most of what the ocean provided, while also developing techniques for preserving food for long ocean voyages. The feast began with poi, a paste made from taro root that had been cooked and pounded until it was smooth and creamy. The taro was grown in flooded fields called loe, and the preparation of poi was a communal activity that brought families together. The poi was served in gourds and eaten with the fingers, creating a connection between the food and the people who ate it. Next came lau lau, pork that had been wrapped in taro leaves and steamed in underground ovens called imu. The pork was cooked for hours until it was so tender it fell apart at the touch of a fork. The taro leaves added a slightly bitter flavor that balanced the richness of the meat. But perhaps the most unusual dish was limu, seaweed that had been harvested from the reefs surrounding the islands. There were dozens of different varieties, each with its own unique flavor and texture. The seaweed was served fresh, dried, or pickled, and was considered essential for maintaining health in the tropical climate. The Polynesian feast also featured opa, a large deep-sea fish that was caught with bone hooks and lines made from plant fibers. The fish was so large that it could feed an entire village, and different parts of the fish were prepared in different ways. The flesh was grilled over open fires, the bones were made into soup, and the skin was dried and used as a flavoring for other dishes. Another remarkable dish was breadfruit, a starchy fruit that was a staple of the Polynesian diet. The fruit was cooked in the imu until it was soft and creamy, then mashed with coconut milk and served as a side dish. The breadfruit was so important to Polynesian culture that it was considered sacred, and there were special ceremonies associated with its harvest. The meal continued with coconut crab, large crabs that lived in the coconut palms and were considered a great delicacy. The crabs were cooked in their own shells over hot coals, and the meat was flavored with coconut milk and native herbs. The result was a dish that was both exotic and familiar, with flavors that were uniquely Polynesian. As the evening progressed, the guests were served haupia, a dessert made from coconut milk that had been thickened with arrowroot. The dessert was served in squares cut from coconut shells, and the smooth, creamy texture was the perfect ending to a meal that celebrated the abundance of the Pacific. The feast concluded with kava, a drink made from the root of a plant that grew throughout the Polynesian islands. The root was chewed or pounded into a paste, then mixed with water to create a mildly narcotic drink that was said to promote peace and fellowship. The kava was served in coconut shells, and the act of sharing the drink was as important as the drink itself.
The Native American Feast of the Three Sisters. Let's drift back across the Pacific to the forests of North America around 1300, where the Iroquois people are preparing for the green corn ceremony, a celebration that honors the three sisters, corn, beans, and squash, the crops that form the foundation of their diet. The Native American approach to food was deeply spiritual, with every meal seen as a gift from the Creator. Their agricultural techniques were sophisticated and sustainable, designed to work with nature rather than against it. The feast began with succotash, a dish made from fresh corn and lima beans that had been cooked together in a pot made from clay. The corn and beans were planted together in the same hills, with the beans climbing up the corn stalks and the corn providing support for the beans. This companion planting not only saved space, but also improved the soil, as the beans fixed nitrogen that the corn could use. Next came Three Sisters soup, a hearty stew that combined corn, beans, and squash with wild game and herbs. The soup was cooked in large pottery vessels over fires that were never allowed to go out, and the slow cooking process created a rich, complex flavor that was both nourishing and satisfying. But perhaps the most unusual dish was pemmican, a concentrated food that was made from dried meat, fat, and berries. The meat was usually buffalo or venison that had been cut into thin strips and dried in the sun. The dried meat was then pounded into a powder and mixed with rendered fat and dried berries, creating a food that was both nutritious and portable. The Native American feast also featured maple syrup, but not the refined product we know today. This was maple sugar, made by boiling down the sap of maple trees until it crystallized. The process took days of constant tending, and the resulting sugar was darker and more complex than modern maple syrup, with a flavor that was both sweet and slightly smoky. Another remarkable dish was wild rice, which wasn't actually rice at all, but the seeds of aquatic grasses that grew in the lakes and rivers of the northern forests. The rice was harvested by canoe, with one person paddling while another used wooden sticks to knock the seeds into the boat. The rice was then parched over fires to remove the hulls, creating a nutty, chewy grain that was both nutritious and delicious. The meal continued with fry bread, a simple bread made from cornmeal and water that was cooked on hot stones. The bread was often flavored with herbs or nuts, and it was eaten with honey or maple syrup. The bread was considered sacred, and there were special ceremonies associated with its preparation. As the evening progressed, the guests were served kinnikinnick, a smoking mixture made from various plants, including red willow bark and bearberry leaves. The mixture was smoked in special pipes as a way of giving thanks for the meal and connecting with the spiritual world. The feast concluded with wajapi, a pudding made from berries that had been cooked with honey and cornmeal. The pudding was served in bowls made from gourds, and the sweet, fruity flavor was the perfect ending to a meal that celebrated the harmony between humans and nature.
The African Feast of the Sahel. Our journey now takes us to the Sahel region of Africa, around 1200, where the Empire of Mali is at its height. Here, in the great trading city of Timbuktu, merchants from across Africa and the Middle East are gathering for a feast that will showcase the incredible diversity of African cuisine.
The African approach to food was shaped by the continent's incredible diversity of climates and cultures, from the deserts of the north to the rainforests of the south. Each region had developed its own unique ingredients and cooking techniques. The feast began with fufu, a starchy staple made from cassava, yams, or plantains that had been boiled and pounded until it was smooth and elastic. The fufu was served in large bowls and was eaten with the hands, using pieces of the starchy paste to scoop up stews and sauces. The texture was unlike anything found in other cuisines, and the bland flavor provided the perfect base for the complex sauces that accompanied it. Next came injera, a spongy bread made from teff, a tiny grain that grew only in the highlands of Ethiopia. The teff was ground into flour and fermented for several days, creating a batter that was cooked on special clay griddles. The result was a bread that was both tangy and slightly sour, with a texture that was perfect for soaking up sauces and stews. But perhaps the most unusual dish was biltong, dried meat that was similar to the jerky we encountered in South America, but with a distinctly African twist. The meat was cut into strips and cured with salt, vinegar, and spices, then hung to dry in the hot, dry air of the savannah. The result was a meat that was both flavorful and nutritious, perfect for long journeys across the desert. The African feast also featured plantains, large bananas that were cooked rather than eaten raw. The plantains were roasted over open fires until the skin was black and the flesh was soft and sweet. They were often served with groundnut sauce, a rich, creamy sauce made from peanuts that had been ground into a paste and cooked with vegetables and spices. Another remarkable dish was millet, a grain that was perfectly adapted to the dry conditions of the Sahel. The millet was cooked into a porridge and served with baobab fruit, a tangy fruit that grew on the iconic baobab trees of the African savanna. The fruit was high in vitamin C and provided a perfect complement to the mild flavor of the millet. The meal continued with locusts, roasted grasshoppers that were considered a delicacy throughout much of Africa. The locusts were caught during their seasonal migrations and roasted over open fires until they were crispy and golden. They were often seasoned with salt and spices, creating a snack that was both crunchy and flavorful. As the evening progressed, the guests were served palm wine, a fermented drink made from the sap of palm trees. The sap was collected by making cuts in the trunk of the tree and collecting the liquid that flowed out. The sap was then fermented for several days, creating a mildly alcoholic drink that was both refreshing and nutritious. The feast concluded with kola nuts, bitter nuts that were chewed as a stimulant and were considered a symbol of hospitality throughout West Africa. The nuts were served on special plates made from gourds, and the act of sharing the nuts was as important as the nuts themselves.
The medieval European monastery kitchen. Let's return to medieval Europe, but this time to a very different setting. The kitchen of a Benedictine monastery in the mountains of Switzerland around 1250. Here, the monks have developed a cuisine that is both ascetic and surprisingly sophisticated, designed to nourish the body while purifying the soul. The monastic approach to food was shaped by religious principles that emphasized simplicity, frugality, and the avoidance of excess. Yet within these constraints, the monks had developed cooking techniques and food combinations that were remarkably innovative. The day began with pulse, a simple porridge made from whatever grains were available: barley, oats, or sometimes even ground acorns during times of scarcity. The porridge was cooked slowly over the monastery's perpetual fire, stirred by different monks throughout the night as part of their prayer vigil. The result was a dish that was both sustaining and symbolic, representing the community's shared devotion. The main meal featured pottage, a thick soup that was the cornerstone of monastic cuisine. But this wasn't simple vegetable soup. It was a complex creation that changed with the seasons and the availability of ingredients. In spring, it might contain fresh herbs and early vegetables. In summer, it would be rich with beans and grains. In autumn, it would include the last of the harvest, and in winter, it would be made with dried vegetables and preserved meats. But perhaps the most unusual aspect of monastic cuisine was the herbarium, the monastery's herb garden, which contained not just culinary herbs, but also medicinal plants. The monks had developed a sophisticated understanding of the healing properties of different plants, and their meals were designed to promote health as well as satisfy hunger. One of the most remarkable dishes was electuary, a medicine-food hybrid that combined honey with various herbs and spices. The electuary was served in small portions after meals, and each combination was designed to treat specific ailments. There was an electuary for digestion, one for respiratory problems, and another for mental clarity. The monks also prepared verjuice, a tart liquid made from unripe grapes that was used both as a medicine and as a flavoring for food. The verjuice was aged in wooden barrels for months, developing a complex flavor that was both sour and slightly sweet. It was used to preserve vegetables, flavor stews, and even as a drink when mixed with water. Another unusual monastic food was mortadella, but not the lunch meat we know today. This was a sausage made from pork that had been ground with pine nuts, spices, and herbs, then stuffed into casings and aged in the monastery's cellars. The aging process could take months, and the result was a sausage that was both flavorful and nutritious. The meal continued with cheese, but not ordinary cheese. The monks had developed unique aging techniques that created flavors found nowhere else. Some cheeses were aged in caves beneath the monastery. Others were wrapped in leaves and buried in the earth, and still others were aged in wooden boxes that had been rubbed with herbs and spices. As the day progressed, the monks would take their collation, a light meal that was designed to sustain them through the evening prayers. The collation might include comfits, seeds or nuts that had been coated with sugar and spices, or quince paste, a sweet preserve that was both delicious and medicinal. The day concluded with caudle, a warm drink made from ale, eggs, and spices that was served to the sick and the elderly. The caudle was prepared in the monastery's infirmary and was believed to have healing properties. It was served in special cups made from wood or pewter, and the act of preparing and serving it was seen as an act of charity.
The Byzantine Feast of Empires. Our journey now takes us to Constantinople around 1050
at the height of the Byzantine Empire. Here in the Great Palace, Emperor Constantine IX Monomachos is hosting a feast that will showcase the incredible wealth and sophistication of the Eastern Roman Empire. The Byzantine approach to food was influenced by the empire's position at the crossroads of Europe and Asia. Ingredients and techniques from across the known world converged in Constantinople, creating a cuisine that was both exotic and refined. The feast began with meze, small dishes that were designed to stimulate the appetite and showcase the variety of ingredients available in the empire. There were dolmades, grape leaves stuffed with rice and herbs; taramosalata, a paste made from fish roe and olive oil; and scordalia, a sauce made from garlic, bread, and nuts. Next came souvlaki, but not the simple grilled meat we know today. This was lamb that had been marinated in wine, honey, and spices, then grilled over charcoal made from specific types of wood. The meat was so tender it could be cut with a fork, and the marinade created a glaze that was both sweet and savory. But perhaps the most unusual dish was garum, the fermented fish sauce that was beloved throughout the Roman world. The Byzantines had refined the production of garum to an art form, creating dozens of different varieties with different flavors and intensities. There was garum made from tuna, garum made from anchovies, and even garum made from sea urchins. The Byzantine feast also featured baklava, but not the sweet pastry we know today. This was a savory version, made with layers of phyllo dough filled with cheese, herbs, and nuts, then baked until golden and crispy. The pastry was so delicate it seemed to melt in the mouth, and the combination of textures and flavors was both complex and satisfying. Another remarkable dish was pilaf, rice that had been cooked in broth and flavored with saffron, the most expensive spice in the world. The saffron gave the rice a golden color and a complex, slightly bitter flavor that was both exotic and luxurious. The pilaf was often garnished with nuts and dried fruits, creating a dish that was both beautiful and delicious. The meal continued with resina, a white wine that had been flavored with pine resin. The resin gave the wine a unique flavor that was both refreshing and slightly medicinal. The wine was served in special glasses made from silver or gold, and the act of drinking it was as important as the wine itself. As the evening progressed, the guests were served lukumades, small donuts that were deep-fried until golden and crispy, then soaked in honey and sprinkled with cinnamon. The donuts were served warm, and the combination of the crispy exterior and the gooey interior was both indulgent and satisfying. The feast concluded with mastika, a liqueur made from the resin of the mastic tree. The liqueur was clear and had a unique flavor that was both herbal and slightly bitter. It was served in small glasses and was believed to have digestive properties.
The closing of our journey. As our long journey through time draws to a close, we find ourselves back in the present, in a quiet kitchen somewhere in the modern world. The sun is setting outside, and the familiar sounds of contemporary life, cars passing, neighbors talking, the hum of refrigerators, seem almost alien after our travels through the strange and wonderful world of historical cuisine. We've tasted the jellyfish of ancient Rome, the fermented shark of the Vikings, the bird's nest soup of imperial China, and the grasshoppers of the Aztecs. We've experienced the elaborate subtleties of medieval England, the minimalist perfection of Japanese kaiseki, the high-altitude cuisine of the Incas, and the sustainable abundance of Aboriginal Australia. Each of these meals tells a story, not just of food, but of the people who prepared and consumed it. The Roman senator showing off his wealth with exotic ingredients, the Viking chieftain preparing his people for the long winter ahead, the Chinese emperor seeking immortality through carefully prepared delicacies, the Aztec ruler honoring his gods with offerings of chocolate and amaranth. These weren't just meals, they were expressions of culture, belief, and survival. They were ways of connecting with the divine, of marking important occasions, of building community, and of making sense of the world. As you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps you'll dream of these ancient feasts. Perhaps you'll find yourself reclining on silk cushions in a Roman villa, or sharing kava with Polynesian navigators, or watching the sunrise over a Buddhist monastery while sipping tea made from flowers that bloom only once a year. Or perhaps you'll simply rest, knowing that throughout history, people have gathered around tables and fires, sharing food and stories, creating the bonds that make us human. The ingredients may change, the techniques may evolve, but the fundamental human need to nourish and be nourished, to gather and share, to transform the raw materials of the earth into something that sustains both body and soul, this remains constant. So sleep well, dream deeply, and remember that you are part of this great continuing story of human civilization, one meal at a time. And with that gentle thought, let the soft rhythm of history carry you into peaceful sleep, where the echoes of ancient kitchens and the whispers of long-ago feasts will watch over your dreams until morning comes.